I've brought our flooring expert, our coatings expert, onto the program today. His name is Spencer Little from Deluxe Garages. Spencer, how you doing today?
I'm doing great. How about yourself?
Fantastic. It's great to have you here. This question comes up a lot, I know. And even I have these questions because I don't fully understand. And that is the difference between epoxy, polyurea, and polyaspartic. We hear these three different terms all the time when it comes to coating floors and other concrete surfaces. Can you tell my listeners what is the difference amongst these three?
Yeah, I would love to chat a little bit about that. So the answer can be quite complex from a chemical perspective, and we'll touch on that just a little bit, but we'll try to keep it mostly high level. They're all part of a polymer family, right? These are all type of resin flooring, and oftentimes the finishing can look very similar, right? So someone can come in with an epoxy floor and they say, "Hey, man, I can do the same thing that Deluxe is doing with a polyurea floor." And the answer is that they can in a certain instance, and they can't in certain instances. So what epoxy has a really great adhesion to the concrete. So it absorbs into the concrete really well, and something that that's a real plus for epoxy, right? There's pros and cons for all of these types of floors. Where epoxy kind of falls short, though, and the reason why we moved to these poly systems is because it's not UV stable. So in the sun, if someone is selling you an epoxy floor, like for instance in your pool deck, that floor is going to yellow over time. You may not notice it, but if I go and put fresh material down next to your old material and we split it up, you're going to start to see all the yellowness that's happened into that epoxy floor. So that's one thing. Epoxy is not UV stable. Polyaspartic coatings are UV stable. Another thing is the chemical composition of epoxy makes it harden over its lifetime. So once you put epoxy down, that's the softest it's going to ever be. And throughout its lifetime, it's going to continue to get harder and harder and harder and harder. And eventually, it's going to become brittle and break. Why? Because what does concrete do? Like, what is the one thing that we can guarantee that concrete does? And that's it cracks, right? Concrete cracks. If you can show me a slab of concrete that has no cracks in it, I'll give you $1,000 right now because it just doesn't exist. And so because that epoxy gets harder and harder over time, it's not able to move with that concrete in those cracks as they exist. So the polyurea and those polyaspartic coatings, instead of hardening over time, they're more like a sheet of rubber, right? And so they're really flexible and they're able to move with that concrete. So that's the reason why we choose the polyurea polyaspartic coating is the flexibility to be able to move with that concrete, the UV stableness. Now, quickly, there are some instances where epoxy is the better option, and that's if you have a moisture issue. In Central Texas, we very rarely run into moisture issues. 99% of the slabs that we get tested, and we test every slab that goes out. This is the reason why we can't just give you a quote over the phone for moisture content in the concrete. But 99% of our slabs are less than 3 pounds. If you start to see in the 8 to 9 pound range, that's when you want to go with a moisture vapor barrier and go more to epoxy. But we just don't see that very often in Central Texas.
Spencer, thank you so much. You've answered my questions for sure on that. It's there are big differences, and to really understand what the right type of coating is for your flooring, you got to get a hold of Spencer and his team over at Deluxe Garages. Go to deluxegarages.com.